thought I was just somebody weird because I did not have a San Francisco Chinatown accent. They didn't think I was Chinese. They asked where I came from, and I said Pennsylvania. What's that? Well, I actually said Pittsburgh. They said, oh, Pittsburgh, California? No, Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So the tracked homeroom was such that you went tracked to social studies, math, science with the same kids from that homeroom. And that was the way it was. When I was a young teacher starting out as a teacher in San Francisco in 1968, the school system was still tracked. And I was assigned to a school in the Richmond district, teaching English, regular English. When I got there, I had 1 X class, 2 Y classes, and 2 Z classes. That was the track, and you can imagine what the Z classes were like. And in 1968, we started seeing students being assigned who were immigrants from Hong Kong into Roosevelt Junior High School. That was unheard of because very few Chinese lived outside of the Chinatown area. There were a few, but the ones that were foreign-born usually got assigned outside of Chinatown to Ben Franklin, where Tony Metcalf was starting up a Chinese bilingual program. That was before Lowell. You have to understand that in secondary there was absolutely nothing. No ESL classes. Francisco had Americanization. High schools had compensatory education. So at Roosevelt, there was only XYZ classes and special ed classes, that's it. So by 1969, I had to try to convince the administration there that these students are unfairly being treated by being thrown into usually the C classes and special ed. I had students, I had Ernest Tushia from Cuba who spoke Spanish and no Japanese. I had Maria Lee, who also from Cuba, who spoke Spanish and a rural Chinese dialect. I had the Hong Kong Cantonese students who were just thrown into regular, sink or swim, that was the technique. So I finally convinced the administration that I was willing to regroup the students and teach those classes. This is before testing. This is before English second language was even heard of in junior high school and high school. And so in 1969, 70, and 71, I was the English second language teacher teaching the NEP, FIP, and LEP. Now, you may not know what that means, but NEP means non-English speaking. LEP means limited English speaking, and FEP means fluent English speaking, and they transition out to regular ed. So by 1971, which is still before the Lowell, I was asked by Tony Metcalf, who was running the Chinese bilingual program at Ben Franklin, out of resources I don't know where they came from. There was absolutely no funding. She pulled together under Wellington Chu at the bilingual department a program that was functioning at Ben Franklin, and she supported me. She says, I'm going to put you at Washington High School. Follow your students. And in 1971, I arrived at Washington High School ready to fight. And I had Saul Baffis as the principal, and he did not know what this Chinese American teacher was all about. He looked at me with very skeptical eyes. He questioned everything I said and wanted to do. So, but he finally begrudgingly said, okay, you do whatever you like, and you work with the scheduler, who was George Lai, I think, at the time, and put together some classes. And so we were able to work out a program, and I taught all the classes. In about another year, there was a half-time teacher that was brought in to teach the overflow. So when the Lowell came through, it took a while for the funding, the federal funding to come through. But in 1977, I was called by the district to go to a meeting to learn how to write for the grant called SB 1641. This was the federal funding that came through Sacramento to support programs in San Francisco Unified. And all the high school coordinators at the time were asked to locally write the grant for the funding. And so it was a heavy time, but it was a very energetic time. There was somebody from Catherine Lai from Galileo High School, and Calvin Hyena from McAteer. And there was Mission High School, Margaret Brindle from Mission High School. So these were the high school coordinators. By the time we were able to get that through, and after a few years, when I left in 1984 to take on an administrative position, at Washington High School we had 7 or 8 bilingual paraprofessionals, 7 or 8 teachers teaching ESL and bilingual sessions. And we had 650 identified students and a budget of $750,000 from federal funding. But I would say that that was really the beginning of the large programs that were in elementary, middle, and high school in those days. So,
thank you so much, Jennie. There's one thing I just want to point out, and it's a link to what Lin Chi Wong was saying to the rest of you earlier. The site administration has a lot to do with whether a program can germinate and survive. If you have a principal, and I don't mean to demean former principals, but if you have somebody like, Mr. Orsini over at Commodore Stockton, who's have that mindset, and you go to a high school, like at Washington, where somebody else, may have another mindset that does not permit some of the things that, that we think are important, you will have some obstacles you have to overcome. So Jennie was one of those pioneers who had to fight that, those forces. So we're going to go from one pioneer to another pioneer, Jean Ramirez.
Thank you. I married a San Franciscan in 1967. I had been teaching in Spanish Harlem in New York, and that's how I ended up in San Francisco. And in '67, I taught at the College of Notre Dame in Belmont, that's what it was called in those days. And I was in charge of their foreign students. They had always had a lot of foreign students, but those students had scored very high on the TOEFL. But they had decided they would bring others in because a lot of money came with foreign students. But the students that I received had not scored well on the TOEFL, and they had not been told that they were going to have to take ESL. And the school didn't understand that to keep a foreign student visa, you had to be taking regular classes in addition. Anyway, to make a long story short, my students were mainly Spanish speakers from South America and speakers of Chinese from Hong Kong primarily, and 2 graduate students from Japan. And most of my Chinese students were quite literate in English, although nothing orally. By mid-year, most of the Chinese students were able to move into the regular program. It was interesting to me that some of my students would come and say, "Sister said I'm a dumbhead." And I'd have to call up and I'd say, "This isn't, Anyway, but the interesting point at mid-year was, since I lost this component of Chinese students, they gave me all of the D and F native English speakers. And I said, no. This is apples and oranges. These are highly educated students from other countries who happen not to be proficient in English. So at the end of the year, I wrote a big recommendation basically saying you have to dissolve this program until you get your act together. And actually, it took about 11 years, and now they have a very strong program. So at that time, I was without a job, and it happened that in 1968, they were going to start the Spanish bilingual program in San Francisco. And they had a summer bilingual program before that fall of '68, and I was able to teach in that. So the decision was there would be, and I'm speaking at this point mainly about elementary, although over my career I worked in all the grades. I had the first Spanish bilingual kindergarten. Some of you who are been in San Francisco a while may have heard the name Hawthorne Elementary School, which is in the Mission, which a number of years ago, many years ago, was renamed Cesar Chavez, and is now a very strong bilingual school. Well, in those days, the students that I had were the kindergarten students who were the least proficient in English, but they were on the school's register. But for some reason, because they couldn't speak English, there was no room in the building for them. So the district, and again, another one of those situations where you don't know where money came from, rented a room in the Primera Iglesia Bautista del Sur on South Van Ness Avenue. And every day, twice a day, I would walk the students. I had no phone for 6 months. I had one adult toilet, and I made a little step stool so the kids could get up there. And I said to the principal, Mrs. Baker, I said, I had no supplies. They had given me some tables and chairs from the warehouse, and the room was about less than the third of a size of a regular kindergarten room. So I went to the principal and I said, I need materials. And she said to me, they're your children. And I was young and